Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 26th week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Residents of CU founded Aware just after the attacks of 9/11-2001 because they saw that the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to continue to kill people in the Mideast, in continuation of America's long-standing attempt to control the energy resources of the region. Control, not just access, is what the U.S. demanded since the Second World War, because control of the supply of gas and oil is an unparalleled weapon against America's economic competitors from Germany to China. That economic competition is the reason President Obama is today making war in 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of the Charter of the United Nations, which forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. President Obama is sending American death squads, we call them Special Operation Forces, into more than 100 countries around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. And President Obama is conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone that has already killed thousands, including American citizens and hundreds of children. And he's recklessly provoking war with Russia and Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, more than U.S. client Israel killed in Gaza last year, and with China and the South China Sea. These worldwide murders are not done in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who are taxed to pay for them and forced to forego government services to the point that the U.S. is now the most unequal developed country, and is becoming more so at an increasing rate. But the wars are in the interest of a very few Americans, the very rich, the 1%, who profit enormously from the U.S. control of the world economy. In Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya, the United States is playing out what may be the last bloody chapters of its attempt to dominate the energy basin of the world through terror. Washington's policy in the Arab and Muslim world has always been terror: the terror of shock and awe invasion of Iraq in 2003, the constant terrors inflicted by the 51st state, Israel, which has waged endless war against its neighbors with impunity for almost 70 years under the U.S. military and diplomatic umbrella, the totally unprovoked terror that rained NATO bombs over Libya for 7 months in 2011, allowing the dark night of jihadism and ethnic cleansing to descend on what had been Africa's most prosperous country, and then sending these jihadists to commit a similar bloodbath in Syria. The international jihadist network owes its very existence to the United States, which in a joint venture with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia spent billions creating the global infrastructure of terror with its headquarters in Afghanistan starting in the late 1970s. More than 3 decades later, the U.S. and its filthy rich royal Arab allies in the Persian Gulf have become totally dependent on the jihadists that they have unleashed on humanity. Washington's virtual sponsorship of the Israeli state and America's own epic crimes in the Middle East means the United States has no natural allies among the people. Plus, America's deep-rooted racism renders it unfit to completely negotiate, to competently negotiate the services of Islamic jihadists to fight imperialism's battles. For this, and to pick up a portion of the tab, the U.S. needs the Saudis and other wealthy Arabs. The Arab kings and emirs are also dependent on the jihadists, since their own armed forces are comprised mainly of mercenaries. The Muslim politician who runs Turkey also relies on the jihadists to fight his war against Syria, and he would risk bringing chaos to his own country and being ousted from office if he directly attacked Syria. The Americans and the Saudis believe they could buy the jihadist services and then discard them when no longer needed. Instead, they've created a Frankenstein, whose Islamic State component has already declared its intention to sweep away the Arab monarchies, along with the great Satan, the U.S. The other al-Qaeda branches will also turn against their creators when the time is right. Who then will be left to defend the U.S. empire's interests in the region? The CIA recently sent a drone to kill al-Qaeda's top guy in Yemen, the town of Mukalla. Mukalla's airport is the only one in Yemen that Saudi Arabia hasn't bombed because the Saudis are allied with al-Qaeda in their war against the Houthis. In fact, they depend on al-Qaeda because the Saudi army is incapable of occupying Yemen. The U.S. is also a critical ally of Saudi Arabia in the Yemen war. Al-Qaeda and the U.S. are on the same side in Yemen, just as they are in Syria. But of course, in the long run, their interests are irreconcilable. In the end, the jihadists, who have grown exponentially stronger, will remain a force in the region. The U.S. will be expelled, and royal Saudi heads will roll, or so suggests the estimable Glenn Ford. But Americans know little of this, because the Obama administration lies and the big business media swear to it. Tonight we'll try to give a better account with commentaries by Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, Gus Wood, and Pam Carsey. And we'll begin with Ron Zoke on Athens in Charleston.
Yes, well, these are part of the traditional story about the rise and fall of democracy. It supposedly was born in Athens and is dying, it appears, in the USA, and especially in Charleston, South Carolina, as it would appear. In Greece, we have a continuing story of suspense, the perils of Hellas. The Greek people seem to be on the hook for about 1.6 billion euros, or I'm sorry, that's dollars, due on the last day of June. Does this mean that they will exit the Eurozone? The consequences of that are unknown and seem to be disturbing a lot of people. The situation is being blamed, for example, for the fluctuations in the American stock market. Both sides in the negotiations there have become a little nasty. Christine Lagarde of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has become rather snotty about the negotiators, wishing that there were some adults in the room and so on. Both sides have strong incentives to reach a deal, but whether that will happen is anyone's guess. About €1 billion were withdrawn from Greek banks Friday the 19th, but the final deadline is supposed to be the last day of June, as I mentioned, on 6:30, and what I suspect is that there will be no definitive resolution. They will muddle through again. Turning to the USA, and in particular to South Carolina and the events of last week in Charleston, South Carolina, the way this has been played in the media is absolutely amazing. To many, it appears the big issue is the Confederate flag and what it symbolizes. I have a lot of trouble with trying to discuss political symbolism because symbols can mean, any symbol can mean anything to someone, and I really have very little interest in arguing for or against any particular symbols. In particular, it seems to me that the Chief Illini WEC controversy was a waste of time and energy that could have been put to better use elsewhere, but let that pass. It again emphasizes that, or confirms what some people have said, that politics, as we know it, is largely kind of applied demonology. And I'm not interested in furthering any of the thinking by association that goes on. A reminds someone of B, and so they will praise or condemn it on that basis. Try to get people to think by inference, and hopefully well supported inference, but that seems to be going nowhere. The interpretation you get on Fox News, for example, is that the massacre was anti-Christian and not anti-black. And for the story that they've been telling, the Fox News narrative, this is crucially important to absolve this kind of thing of all racism and to claim that it's really due to something else. One of their favorite lines, of course, is that Christians and Christianity is under attack, that war is being made against it, and so on, which is, to me, utter nonsense, but apparently some people believe it. So here we are in the jungle of symbols. It's amazing, again, to me, how important symbols are to people and what they will try to make out of them. Consider not only the flag, any flag, but the cross or crucifix, the gun, which is a symbol in itself. You can see people scatter when one appears in a public place. The Bible, the Star of David, the menorah, the swastika, Chief Illini, as I mentioned, corporate logos, the Confederate stars and bars, symbolizes to a lot of people our heritage in the South, or we're honoring the Confederate dead and so on. Others seem to think it represents rebellion and defiance, and they seem to value it for that reason. So Walmart is said to be removing all Confederate flag images on merchandise, all their merchandise from their stores. And so we're off on another totally inconclusive rant about symbolism and what should be done about the Confederate flag near the State House in South Carolina and so on. And once again, I'm not impressed by any of that, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate it. You're listening to Aware on the Air, comments on war making by the U.S. and attendant evils. We'll turn to Karen Aram and the pivot to Asia.
Yes, okay. Well, this is about the Japanese protest that were denouncing the new military legislation in Japan. There were protests held Sunday a week ago at various different locations in the capital to denounce the government's new military legislation, which is currently being debated in the legislature. Now, if passed, these bills would greatly expand the role and reach of the Japanese self-defense forces. They were submitted to Parliament in May after receiving the backing of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and its coalition partner, Komeito. Now, we know that Minister Shinzo Abe's remilitarization agenda is behind this proposal. And of course, we know who's behind Abe and the militarization of Japan, something that many of us were warned about. I was warned about when I was studying in Japan as late as 1970, by Japanese professors, by the way, who said that we should never remilitarize Japan, and here the U.S. is doing it now. Now, there were about 25,000 protesters, by the way, and then later there were more demonstrations with approximately 300 students. And the students seemed to be quite concerned because there were as many as 3 legal scholars, constitutional legal scholars, who are saying that this is totally unconstitutional. And the students are also concerned that basically it's unconstitutional. This article is known as the article to destroy is Article 9. And it's known as the pacifist clause renouncing war. So many of the students, they say we have no right to vote in elections, but we're strongly against war. Now, so the students are supporting the law scholars who, even though one was appointed by the leading party. Now, even though the two other opposition parties are speaking out against this bill to remove Article 9, nonetheless, from what I've been hearing and reading, that's just hearsay. They're speaking out against it, but in the end, they're probably going to support it, and even to the point whereby they are extending, they're going to extend Parliament from, which should come to an end in July. They're actually going to suspend it not suspend it, they're going to extend it until September in order to pass this military bill this summer. And this is very dangerous, as we know. On the same topic, I want to point out that in the South China Sea, we have to look at the air-sea battle plans, okay, that the U.S. has been advocating with the imposition of a naval blockade, which would prevent Chinese shipping passing through the key sea lanes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans into the South China Sea. I've talked about this a great deal for the past year and a half. It would possibly blockade the Malacca Straits, which if this happens, it would block almost all of China's oil imports, and it would literally close down their industry. So I think we also know what a confrontation of that order which would entail. And we are talking about nuclear powers here, people. Now, at the moment, and again, I wish I could say that the protests are empowering. They are, to know that the Japanese people, so many of them, are opposed to remilitarization, but at the same time, knowing that their government is likely not to listen to them, something that we here have experienced. At the same time, the Indian Navy has just deployed 4 warships to the Malaysian port of Kuantan. The next week, or probably this week, the Philippines military will be carrying out separate training exercises with both U.S. and Japanese forces near Palawan Island in the South China Sea. A Vietnamese nationalist businessman intends to send a tourist ship into the Spratly Islands on June 22nd to arouse national pride and citizen consciousness of the sacred sovereignty of the country. And of course, it's the Diaoyu Islands that the Japanese have been concerned about with the Chinese. The operations that China will be following, though, most closely, however, is the massive Talisman Sabre exercise that will be taking place in July in northern Australia, which involves the U.S. and Australian militaries, along with contingents from New Zealand and Japan. The George Washington Aircraft Carrier Battle Group arrived in Brisbane this week ahead of the exercise. So in total, we have some 33,000 troops, 21 ships and submarines, and over 200 aircraft will be carrying out what amounts to a rehearsal for a military confrontation with China in the South China Sea by a joint U.S.-Australian task force. So be afraid, people. Be very afraid.
Thank you, Karen. You are watching Aware on the Air. We'll turn to Gus Wood.
As former co-president and current solidarity officer of the Graduate Employees Organization, this is a statement regarding the massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church. The Graduate Employees Organization Local 6300 AFL-CIO of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign speaks out against the horrific racially motivated murder of 9 black men and women who were at a prayer and Bible study meeting on June 17, 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina. We grieve with those across the nation whose hearts, like ours, are deeply saddened by this devastating loss of human life, especially the survivors and family and friends of those whose lives were stolen. Further, we condemn the attack against the historically renowned Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Emmanuel AME Church is both a site and symbol of black liberation and freedom struggle that carries with it a long history of resistance against systemic anti-black racism, white supremacy, and oppression. These 9 black people tragically lost their lives during a murderous rampage by a 21-year-old white man who attended the midweek service at the church with the express desire to terrorize and assassinate black people. According to reports, when one of the victims attempted to talk him out of killing any more of them, he replied, "I have to do it. You rape our women and you are taking over our country and you have to go." Our hearts are filled with extreme sadness over this act of racial hatred and violence. Unquestionably, the heinous act is the latest chapter in an increasingly degenerative pattern of both state-sponsored and private white terrorism against blacks in 21st century America. What is most alarming is that this wave of anti-black violence frighteningly mirrors the nadir period in this nation's past where between 1890 and 1930, a black man, woman, or child was murdered every 36 hours by white vigilantes and mobs. Thus, racial inequality has significantly regressed in the United States over the past few decades. United States federal and state officials are investigating this racist massacre as a hate crime carried out by a lone wolf. With deep conviction, the GEO argues that downplaying what is in fact an act of actual anti-black terrorism, claiming instead that acts of racist violence in the U.S. for all intents and purposes, the doings of individual extremists not in collaboration with the colonial history, further positions these horrendous episodes of racial violence as isolated, decoupling them from a broader historical context and pushing the fundamental crisis of constitutive systemic oppression to the periphery. The human rights crisis at hand is the violence against not only blacks in the United States, but also women, Native Americans, Latinos and Latinas, the working poor, and other marginalized communities. Is created, sustained, facilitated, and sometimes transformed through the systemic culture of hate based on socially constructed inequality. In other words, capturing and issuing justice to the murderous racists that committed these terroristic acts does not break the culture of hate nor initiate progressive systemic change. Constitutive policies that promote racial, political, social, and particularly economic inequality remain intact. As a result, both violent and nonviolent racist actions continue to fester across the country, purposely expanding the malignant cyst that threatens to permanently destroy underrepresented and disadvantaged peoples and communities. These 9 black women and men join the millions of human lives lost to us forever at the hands of a foundationally unequal, unjust, and racist system that consciously perpetuates policies and practices designed to position the majority of the population in a powerless state. The GEO honors the victims of the Emmanuel Massacre by centralizing their lives and demanding progressive action that thwarts all violence and inequality against all populations. As communities utilize this tragic moment to organize local, national, and global movements against racist violence, it is critical that we challenge not just the action of the individual, but to a greater extent the underlying and undying ideologies, policies, practices that facilitate systems of oppression and inequality. We stand in solidarity with the Emmanuel AME Church family and all communities, organizations, and individuals that desire genuine progressive change to these systems and an end to all local, national, and global inequality and terror. The GEO also calls for all federal, state, and local elected public servants and officials to denounce white supremacy, violence against women, neoliberal imperialism and colonialism, and all foundational inequality, and begin working to seriously restructure our American system to include all people as citizens of this nation.
Thank you very much, Gus. Pam Carsey has comments.
Yeah, I just have a few comments. I heard Gus Wood on this Saturday radio program called the World Labor Hour. It's on WEFT. I think is that at 12 o'clock or 11?
11 o'clock.
Okay, 11 o'clock. And, you know, I had just heard a bunch of reports about the victims of the people who were murdered in South Carolina, and about how they were forgiving, you know, they said that they forgive the perpetrator, and I just wish to say that I was very touched by that. I thought that was just amazing. I just couldn't believe it. It's like, how could anybody be that forgiving? How could anybody be that generous? How, you know. And then I listened to the World Labor Hour, and Gus Wood started talking, and he was kind of critical of the idea that I guess that that this was being emphasized as if to circumvent things, or maybe to just maintain the status quo. We'll admire these folks and then we'll go on with business as usual. I
Right,
assume.
right.
Okay, so when I first heard Gus, I'm thinking, Gus, why are you saying this? It was a wonderful thing these people did, and that was my first reaction. But I continued to listen to him, and I, after he was through and the program was over, I thought about that, and I just thought, why was I so easily led into that? Why was it, what's going on here? So then the next day, I watched Meet the Press. That was Saturday. And they were talking about this incident. And the moderator, I don't remember his name, but he was doing pretty much exactly what I did when I got that, report of this thing. He was like, oh, these are such wonderful people. I can't imagine anybody being that generous and personally generous. And, he was going on in that way. And he had a panel there. One of the panel members was from the Washington Post. He was a black reporter from the Washington Post, and but I'll get back to that. So at any rate, he had this discussion, and then he said, then he kind of moved the discussion over a bit to gun violence, and so then he showed he had a video made of prisoners who were in jail for gun violence, either murder of somebody. So he had 3 different prisoners, young men, talking about how much they regretted what they did, and tears in their eyes, and it was very. The interesting thing was they were all black prisoners. There wasn't one white person who had perpetrated anything. And so, he showed the video, and then he turned to his panel and he just said, this is like so amazing, these young men, and this is so amazing. And he asked the panel their different reactions. And when he got to the reporter from the Washington Post, he just very mildly said, well, it's kind of interesting that you showed that in response to this action that was done by a white perpetrator of this violence in South Carolina, you show 3 black prisoners, 3 black young men who had perpetrated violence with a gun. It's about all he said, and the moderator just kind of said, yeah, I guess that's interesting. Then he went to a commercial break. Okay. So when he comes back from the commercial break, he says, we got a lot of tweets over this commercial break. People were rather upset with our, video, and he said, I'm kind of surprised. He says, that's not what we meant to portray here. And so then he talked again to the reporter from the Washington Post, and the guy said, well, that's why we need lots of conversations about this so that we can start understanding, our own blind spots. So it was just after hearing Gus Wood talk and then watching Meet the Press, it was just amazing how everything was, pun intended, whitewashed. I mean, it was like, and we can just go on with business as usual. We don't have to worry about this stuff. And it's weird because this saying came into my head when I was watching this. Those who have eyes to see with, let them see. Those that have ears to hear with, let them hear. And it occurred to me that the first thing you have to do is choose to see. And you have to choose to hear. And then you have to listen a lot, because we all have our own prejudices. We all have things, we're all victims of propaganda in this country to a huge extent. And so we have to be willing to educate ourselves. We have to, and be honest with ourselves. Not easy to do, but so I just wanted to thank Gus Wood for making the statements he did on the labor hour.
Thank you, Pam. Response, Gus?
Well, I thank you so much for that. What's clearly happening in the media from your experiences, what you're talking about is we have an emergency crisis at the point where they are trying to depoliticize this action. It is clearly a political assassination. Nobody's going to use that term in the media because, you know, like you said, they're trying to whitewash it and depoliticize it. But that's exactly what occurred. There was a situation where this young man knew what he was going to do beforehand. He had planned it. He had talked to people about it. He had been to websites. He had been to all these different things. Then when he actually sat down with them, a lot of people keep asking me about, well, how was he able to sit with them for so long and then shoot them? The young man was able to sit with them for an hour and shoot them because his mind had already been made up about the assassination. That's what he had come to the church to do, and that's what he said. I have come to kill black people. And this is something that has not been addressed enough by the media because they continue to whitewash it. And the reason why it has gone on so far as to where you have the family members now saying that they forgive the shooter. That is not something that I believe is an internal feeling from the family. I argue that there's an issue with a lot of the elite groups, particularly the black elite groups, that go around and they try to pacify the angry black masses who are entirely upset at these racist policies and this systemic racism. Because I can guarantee you, when I speak to people from communities where these things have happened, we do not forgive racist shooters. We don't do it. When somebody's life is gone forever, they're not coming back. We do not forgive them. So this idea of I forgive you is something I believe was implanted in these families, just like it was implanted in other groups in Ferguson, also implanted in other groups in McKinney. I mean, whenever you see these families come out and say, I forgive you, notice that it's days afterwards and it's in a public setting after they have been talked to by people like the Jesse Jacksons and the Al Sharptons and those types of individuals who try to pacify the angry black masses to continue capitalist exploitation of the races. I mean, that's exactly what is going on here. And what it does is it facilitates this atmosphere of hate that is really destroying this country and targeting disadvantaged people. So that's exactly what you have going on at this point is an attempt to depoliticize a political movement by a white supremacist who was acting in the interests of the country, because that's exactly what has been happening in this country since the beginning. When white supremacists want to assassinate blacks, they do it. Vicksburg, 1874. White men went into a building and shot over 50 black people. Some of them were political officials, and they took their seats. And there was no trial. There was nothing. That is something that is just historically done in this country because it's a part of the American system fabric. We have to break that fabric open and restructure it. Otherwise, there's nothing in place to stop this from happening again. That's how we have to move forward.
You guys, comments?
That's exactly the message I got from you on the labor hour, Gus, and it resonated with me. And I think it resonates with anyone who's been involved in any form of what we call radical politics. And I think this is what we need to do, is to educate people. I felt the same way. My heart breaks for the victims' families. But at the same time, I'm so angry, I can't forgive him. So why should they forgive him? And here's something I just want to mention in relation to my experience in Asia, okay? I would talk to young people, say in Hong Kong or in Thailand, of Chinese descent. And they are like the third generation. They still can't forgive the Japanese for what they did in China that many years ago. We're talking about the third generation. They don't talk about it unless you bring it up or something occurs, because it's part of their history. And even though they're not being attacked yet, that's why I say the situation, China is not going to back off. We rely upon China's restraint, okay? Just as I think the white supremacist and our government is relying upon black restraint. But I think at some point we have to look at the situation, both globally and internally, and realize really who the enemies are and how we have to really fight this. We have to fight this.
Pam, Have you ever heard the maxim, there are none so blind as those who will not see?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
fits in real well.
To Gus, this has reopened the question of black resistance to white racism and dominance, and it has recalled for a lot of people the revolt of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, which the word got out somehow that this was going on, and the numbers vary, but 20, 30, 40 black men were tried and hanged as a result of that attempted revolt, where they were going to take a boat to Haiti, which had already been subject to a rebellion, and the black people there were running their own nation the first time that had ever happened. Talk about politicizing this case. This is a constant accusation on Fox News and the right-wing media that the left and the liberals are politicizing this and are exploiting it for their own purposes. And so you are criticizing people for not seeing it as political, and they are doing exactly the opposite of see, he's trying to politicize this tragic situation and use it to advance their own agenda. How do you respond to that?
Well, the fact that it was a political motivated assassination. What I find happening with Fox News and other media giants is that they're in a reactionary position at this point. They're trying to react to a quelling anger amongst the masses of people who see what other people have seen. The first thing they saw when this assassination occurred was that the quote came up, even on CNN News. They even had the quote on there, "I came here to kill black people." That suggests not only a political assassination, but a predetermined political assassination. There was no spontaneous action. This was a planned, motivated murder scenario. And so what's happening is this media corporation sees these groups like what happened in Baltimore, what happened in Ferguson, where you have groups of angry black masses who are rebelling against their position in the country. And what Fox News and other groups are trying to do is they say that they're rioters and they're causing damage and they're thugs and criminals. That's what the president of the United States called these black people, who were honestly motivated and predetermining that they were going to challenge the system by staging an urban rebellion. Historically, whenever black people in this country stage an urban rebellion, acting in a political manner to challenge racism and to challenge economic oppression or any type of disadvantage that they have, there's always been some type of reactionary pose from white supremacists in the media to go in and say, no, these are rioters. Let's criminalize them. They're thugs. They're destroying their own property. They're burning their own stuff. When we, in fact, own nothing. We are burning symbols of white supremacy and hatred. We are attacking the system. And when those things do happen, historically, there has been progressive change in those cities, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in Atlanta, in different areas where blacks have staged urban rebellion and not what they call riots or spontaneous behavior, because all of these rebellions are planned and organized, but they don't show that on the news. There has always been some progressive change afterwards. And the same thing is happening with the situation with the Emmanuel AME Church. They are trying to depoliticize it and take this into an idea about gun control and about Christianity. They are reactionary at this point because the whole signs of the assassination point to it being a political, racist moment. So what we have to do, we have to take the racism out of the moment to try to quell the masses.
I think it's important to stress that these were assassinations, as you say, Gus. These murders occur in the context of a national policy of global assassination. War is being carried out by the United States, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, as it was called many years ago and remains so today. War is being carried out by global assassinations, not only the drone program, but also the special operations program that the President of the United States is commanding around the world. This has been called the most extreme terrorist campaign in the modern world, and it is a campaign of assassination precisely to avoid the commitment of American troops to the American military goals abroad, because if you commit troops, you have casualties, and that produces opposition in a populace that is already opposed in general to America's foreign wars because they know they're not in their interest. But to see these as assassinations then, to put them back in the context, to put the murders in Charleston in the context of the American assassination program, seems to me right. Veterans for Peace, and long-time anti-war group, issued a statement about the Charleston killings in which they said there is a connection between increasing racist violence in the United States and the massive indiscriminate killing of hundreds of thousands of people in other lands. Growing racism against black, brown, and Muslim people in the United States is a reflection of the racism that justifies killing non-white people abroad. The U.S. military deliberately uses racism to motivate young men and women to kill. Now this comes, as I say, from the longtime anti-war veterans group, Veterans for Peace. And it seems to me that as we are putting the murders in Charleston in their political context, as we're rightly urged to do, we put it in a political context that includes the American assassination program, the American militarization of a populace and of a world at large, and we have to understand it that way too. Comments?
A couple of other quick points. Talking about blaming the victim on on an absurd scale. The NRA has said that Reverend Pigney was complicit in his own killing because he wasn't armed and he didn't allow people to carry guns into his church. And if they had all been armed, they could have eliminated this killer. Is there anything more crazy that you can possibly think of?
Well,
I mean,
Hard to come up with
it can't-
anything.
it's
yeah.
not, when you think about it from their particular context, it's
Yeah.
not crazy in their mindset.
Yeah.
Because remember, they're only pushing the agenda. Let's be honest, the majority of the people that make statements like that don't believe those statements, but they do it to push an agenda and to push their own partisanship, because that's exactly what's going on here. The NRA has constantly, whenever we've had mass murders in this country, made those types of statements. This is just the, it's a pattern with them to do these types of things. And they're also trying to depoliticize as well. I mean, it's at the point now where the only people who are being looked at as being culpable in this massacre outside of the shooter are the victims in the church.
Yeah.
And that's what the media is doing. You're going to see a lot of this in the next couple of weeks. They're going to start turning the tables on the victims, on the church, and on the space. You're going to see a lot of that because they are really trying to quell an anger that has led to a lot of things happening in 2015 where the masses have awakened. A lot, not just African Americans, but also brown people, yellow, red, white. Everybody has really awakened, and that's why you received those tweets. You heard about the tweets after Meet the Press. This is something that is not going to go away, and that's what they're trying so hard to do. So they're really going to try to amp up the depolitical tactics and the media blitzkrieg you're going to see in the next few weeks. So
I have a question if we have time.
Yeah. Well,
So
absolutely.
I need to be enlightened. That program I told you about, as my friend calls it, Meet the Mess. The moderator. I mean, it's like I guess one could think of that as a deliberate thing, how they fixed up that program. But is it necessarily so? He seemed totally confused. He really did, especially when he got all those tweets. And it seems to me that we can be in a state of willful ignorance, and I don't know.
one of the best things about being in graduate school and doing all this work is that I learned that there are very few coincidences. That it's very few at this point, that things happen because of predetermined, motivated ideologies, policies, and practices. So this acting confused thing, I believe that was a ruse, because they know for a fact what's happening on that show, what's happening in the country. Those are some of the most informed people in the world. Those are some of the most informed people in the world. And the fact that they are acting confused and things like that, no. That there's no way that we can. Now, of course, there are some willfully sleeping, ignorant people who are not aware of what's going on because of media propaganda, and because there is such a nasty way that they've been doing it. You know, Edward Said talks about it in Culture and Imperialism, how imperialism is driven by culture and the mass media. But let's be clear, though, that after a while, because there are so many incidents happening at this scale since 2014 and moving on, I mean, it's like something every other day at this point. It's actually starting to outweigh the media propaganda. So, willful ignorance is actually starting to decrease at this point, and it's starting to show that the people are waking up to it. But that doesn't stop the right from trying to depoliticize and act confused when they know exactly what's going on, though.
Another aspect of this is what I call the micro application of the Bush Doctrine, that whenever you feel threatened or unsafe, as white Southern males seem to do these days, you're justified in eliminating the source of the threat. So we did that to Iraq, because it was claimed that they were stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, which is a complete lie. But anyway, if there's someone around who makes you feel threatened and unsafe, aren't you always justified in gunning them down? Or firing them, or whatever the case may be?
We know Zimmerman got off scot-free because he felt threatened by a kid with, what? Kibbles, no, whatever they're called. Skittles, right. He felt threatened by a child with Skittles, so he was able to kill him with impunity. So, yeah, that seems to be the state of affairs in the United States today.
Well, I mean, it's like I said, that's historical, though. That's
right.
That's what they've always done.
Yes.
Not killing a disadvantaged person would be an exception to the rule. It's something that is actually radical. It's a radical idea to not use force and violence to keep the status quo of the country, which is inequality. I mean, that I'm just being honest. So this is what they were acting in. They were acting in the characteristics of the United States since its inception, going back to 1607. I mean, that was the first that they massacred the Native Americans. They even started eating themselves because of issues of inequality and ideas of laziness and capitalism. So again, this is something that has historical roots, and that once we address it as being historical, then we can really start digging underneath that to try to restructure the system and hopefully end inequality. And until we do that, then nothing has changed to where this type of situation can't happen again. And that's what's really scary.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I was out of the country for 30-some years, and when I returned in 2010, I mean, I was so pleased to see that, Obama had been elected president, not just because he was articulate and intelligent and I represented peace and change. I mean, that was what I was getting when I was in China. But also, it occurred to me when I saw the inauguration on CNN that, oh my God, yes, he's the first African American. This is historical. And I saw Jesse Jackson and now tears in his eyes, and I got choked up. And then I come back here, and I'm like, my God, I feel like I'm in a time warp. I feel like we're thrown back. Can you comment on that? I know what's happened, but I want to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, this is definitely a regression. As I stated before, what we're looking at now are nadir-like numbers. And for those that don't know much about it, I mentioned it earlier, the nadir period happened at the end of Reconstruction, and it really began with the Vicksburg Massacre of 1874, which ended Reconstruction, where a bunch of black political officials were assassinated in their offices in other parts of the South. And that was when the northern soldiers left. Because let's be honest, the northern capitalists saw a new type of economic situation going on in the South that was going to start bringing industrial capitalism two different areas. So they retreated, Reconstruction collapsed, and the working classes remained divided on racial ideologies. So after that happened with the Vicksburg massacre, you had the nadir period started, where every 36 hours a black man, woman, or child was lynched in different means. So what we have today moving forward is, since 2012, an African American man, woman, or child has been killed every 28 hours now. And at this point in 2015, we are now at over 500 black people who were killed by either police or white vigilantes. So the numbers right now, and those are just the reported numbers. We don't know how many else are out there, and that was the same issue with the nadir period. Those are just the bodies that we found. So that's what's really scary about it. So I really do argue that we are regressing in terms of the systemic racism. And the reason why I see that happening is something that was pointed out earlier, is that there's been a change in the economic structure of global neoliberal imperialism. You have neoliberal capitalism taking place at this point, where historically, whenever economics change in the country, there's always this fear from the white elites and the ruling class that the masses are going to raise up and try to get more stuff, because they're taking opportunities and jobs and money and the means of production away from the people. So that's what you actually see happening, because all of this stuff really started during the Great Recession. That's when the numbers of police shootings, that's when the numbers of mass incarceration, all these things just skyrocketed during the Great Recession, because there's a legitimate fear amongst the ruling class that the masses are going to wake up and try to take things because they're taking things away from us. So I really believe that the political economy of the global situation now is a really big determinant of why there has been so much systemic racism, not just in this country, but of course globally, as the American forces continue their assassination and imperialism.
After, the nadir, the low point in racial relations, does that correspond to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in this country?
Well,
the 1880s, 90s?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, of course, the Ku Klux Klan were the redeemers, or the ones who, and this is funny because we're talking about the Confederate flag controversy going on in the country now, but the Ku Klux Klan, they were the redeemers, the Southern Democrats who were so disillusioned by the Civil War and wanted to retake the country back after Reconstruction because of the Union soldiers being in their areas, because of blacks actually using agency. Let's not forget, blacks were establishing public schools, they were taking public office, they were establishing jobs. I mean, it was really the highest point in black history was the Reconstruction period. And then they had to be repelled by the Ku Klux Klan and other nativist groups who legitimately felt threatened that they were going to lose a lot of their economic stability and security. Mix that in with the Northern capitalists who saw a changing atmosphere in capitalism and this industrial wave, this industrial revolution, this Gilded Age coming to bear. Mix those things up together, you have the Union troops leaving, you have Northern Republicans leaving this idea of radical Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan takes over, and you have these people who assassinate these black officials taking offices in Southern state governments, and you had Jim Crow laws erected, and that's when you had the nadir period really take force in 1890, the lowest point in black history. So yeah, I mean, the Ku Klux Klan, who are still active today, are a major component of a lot of stuff that's going on, and they have historical roots as well.
I posted to the AWARE Facebook page a brief summary of Douglas Blackmon's 2008 book, Slavery by Another Name. This is an account of the what Douglas Blackmon doesn't hesitate to call the re-enslavement of American blacks after the Second World War, after the Civil War down to the Second World War, when their labor became more needed, and the account of how this was done that flies in the face of our notion that the Civil War, quote, freed the slaves, close quote. What it did was make a economic readjustment of the way in which labor was exploited in the South, particularly black labor. And this, as I say, doesn't find its way into many of the history books, but Blackmon's account from a few years ago gives us a first sketch of what the economic substructure of that situation actually was. You've been watching Aware on the Air. We have a couple of moments here for concluding comments, if anybody has one.
No, just another aspect of this, the reemergence of the idea that you're justified in killing someone if they make you feel threatened. And now the police killers of unarmed black men have the formula, the magic words that they always recite. He made me fear for my life. I felt threatened. So I killed him.
Concluding comments? Gus, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. And you have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 26th week of 2015. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Today is what White House aides call Terror Tuesday, the day each week when President Obama picks out some people to be murdered by drones or U.S. death squads, the Special Operations Command. The president's underlings, notably CIA Director John Brennan, compile a list of who should be executed, and the president then chooses from baseball cards who will die. The assassinations are carried out in secrecy. The administration doesn't release accounts of the people they kill, but literally thousands of men, women, and children have been killed on Obama's orders. Many Americans don't know that the U.S. is running this terrorist program. It's thoroughly unconstitutional. Obama should be impeached for it. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this program and others will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael By, David Johnson, David Green, and I hope Gus Wood, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.